Vivekananda Study Circle talk series for this month. To begin with, let us start with the Mangala Shloka. So we begin with that, invoking Swamiji. Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swamini Tapaharine. Today we have all gathered here to listen to our esteemed speaker, Srimati Sahana Singh ji. I hope I have pronounced the name correctly. And she is a commentator and author based in the US and has worked in domains as diverse as water conservation practices and history, educational pedagogy and all those things. So people who are interested in learning more about her work should read her books, number one, and number two, her Facebook posts. So the posts are also important because they cover her chronicles of travels across India. So she travels very frequently. So why choose this topic? Why choose education as a topic for Vivekananda Study Circle? Because the general consensus view about Swamiji is that Swamiji is associated with spirituality. But when we look at a certain quote by Swami Vivekananda, that is, education is the manifestation of the perfection already there in us, there are three legs to it. First is the physical, and the second is where he talks of the mental well-being. The third is the spiritual part. The spiritual part is where the four yogas of Swamiji comes into the picture. The mental is where he talks of arts and aesthetics, something that was deeply dealt with by Sister Nivedita. So we will talk of those things in a minute or so. And the first one is physical, where he talks about physical well-being. So Swamiji was very well adept at different sports and also wanted his own students and followers to be so. Because a healthy body is one that can be used for spiritual pursuits and all other things. There is also a famous quote in the Upanishads, Nayamatma balahinena labhya. That is, the one who is strong is the one who can know the Atma. We're not going into those details, but what is important is to understand how these ideas got implemented. Swamiji's ideas of education got implemented during his own lifetime and by his own contemporaries. So we look at Sister Nivedita. So Sister Nivedita opened up the Nivedita School for Girls in 1902, just a few months after Swamiji's Mahasamadhi. And the school focused on three ideas. First is vocational training. Second is developing entrepreneurial skills for the girls. Third is developing and giving them some very basic spiritual practices so that they can tackle the challenges of their own times. And this effort was also blessed by Ma Sharda because she was there that time. Sister Nivedita kept on developing these ideas, got engaged in conversations with leading educationalists, artists of our own time. One of them was Ananda Kumaraswamy. So Ananda Kumaraswamy is a very famous art critic who came and who was an expert on Indian art. And Sister Nivedita developed her own ideas about Indian art, which led to the development of the Bengal School of Art. So we have a very famous painting of the Bharat Mata, which was painted by Abanindranath Tagore, and that was the birth of the Bengal School of Art, which was later led by Jamini Roy and Nandalal Bose. We know Nandalal Bose for his paintings in the Indian Constitution, for that matter. So Sister Nivedita had that idea. Sister Nivedita also very frequently conversed with prominent Indian scientists of her time, such as Acharya Jagdish Chandra Bose. This is very important to understand that during those times, the Bose Institute that we know today in Calcutta was known in Bengali as the Bosu Vigyan Mandir or the Basu Vigyana Mandiram, which technically means the Bose Temple of Science. The idea was to marry the Jada, the inert, with the Chetana, the conscious. So that idea was always the driving force behind the Acharya's work, Jagdish Chandra Bose's work, which also led to the development of the crescograph, which was meant to study plant movements. So all these ideas of education that were given by Swamiji in a capsule form, in the form of a sutra, were implemented. But unfortunately, due to lack of documentation about India's educational heritage during that time, we didn't have too many people talking about what happened 500 years ago or what happened 1000 years ago and how we can take lessons from that. Although there are a few clues in the writings of Swamiji Sri Aurobindo and Sister Nivedita. For example, one can always look up at how the National College was founded by Sri Aurobindo in 1906. These are things that we should look at for clues. Evidence started emerging in the 1970s and 80s. So, I know that our speaker loves to mention that name, Dharampal, but I would just mention that name here. He was a Gandhian thinker who wrote this book, The Beautiful Tree, and he first provided evidence about India's educational heritage much later, but that was not again in a form which was accessible. So times changed, the language and the idioms also changed. So in a form that is suitable to the audience today and with much more evidence, our present speaker came up with these two books. The first one is The Educational Heritage of Ancient India. So this is a book published by Notion Press. The other one is Revisiting the Educational Heritage of India. So I can always tell that this book, again not to give spoilers, this is a book which contains all her ideas in a sutra form. So if you just want to get a very quick review of what she has done, you can take this, and if you want to know in details, this is the other book. So I request you to go through these things. All our endeavors at PSC begin with Shanti Mantras. So I would like Sangeet to do the Shanti Mantra, and then we can have the speaker. Request the speaker to come on the dais and talk. This one? Yeah, this one. One die.
Namaskar to everybody. I think this is fine. Yeah. Thanks to the few people who have spared time for this talk. I hope that this topic will attract more people in the future, because this is a really important topic that not many people are aware of. So I'm going to be talking about India's educational heritage, which is a hugely inspiring topic, because today, when we look at the status of education in India, we are not able to make out what it used to be. It is something that it's hard to make out today, because there is so much deterioration that has happened. But when you go deeper into the subject, you'll come to know that India was the education educational capital of the world. And there is so much that is inspiring about India's education. There's a lot of hiss coming in my voice? Is it coming okay?
It's fine. It's okay. It's okay.
Okay. Maybe I should keep it closer, further, like this. Okay. So one of the most fascinating things is that just like today, a lot of Indians are trying to gain higher education by going to the US, going to UK. There's literally a mass fleeing from India in order to get education somewhere else because Indian degrees don't matter. That is the kind of image that is being created. Everybody wants a degree from the US or UK. But imagine a situation, a time when it was just the opposite, when people were rushing to come and study in India to get a degree from Nalanda, from Vikramshila, from so many other universities in India. Imagine what it was like. And it was a time when there was a flourishing ecosystem of learning in India, where the conditions were just ideal for research, for study, where the whole society was engaged in supporting scholars who were into studies and research. So this map showing the centers of education in India, this was a labor of love for me. In my first book, I think I barely had 20 centers, Nalanda, Vikramshila and some others. And after that I came to know of so many others that it was almost 100. And that's when I plotted them all on the map and got it into my second book. And you can see that whole of India is literally plastered with universities. You throw a stone and you will hit some Gurukula, some university. That many. You're spoiled for choice. It was that many. And in the eastern part of India, you can see Nalanda, Vikramshila. They're very small here, but if you get the book, you can see clearly. Vikramshila, Jagadala, Somapura, a lot of Biharas. Then you had Nadia, you had Nabadvip as it was called, Mithila. So many of them. And these are just, I have a feeling that we have only plotted maybe 10 or 20% of the educational centers that existed. Because we are so built up that hardly 10% of archaeological digging has happened in our country. There's still 90% left because we are a living civilization. People are building on top of the earlier structures. Okay. So we still don't know the full extent of the number of educational institutions that we had. For example, Telhara was a university that was excavated in 2009 and it was very close to Nalanda. And Telhara was found to be even bigger than Nalanda, much bigger. And it also had more subjects. It was referred to by Xuanzang and some others, and then they went looking for it, the archaeologists, and they found Telhara very close to Nalanda. So just to give you an example of how we still don't know any. And then in the north we had Sharda Peeth in Kashmir. It was a period when Kashmir was called Sharda Desh, because Sharda, the goddess of learning, Saraswati, was the deity of that land, and so the whole land was named after her. And it was a center of immense learning. I mean, the Kashmir today that you see is just the opposite of what it used to be. It was a center where people went in droves because they wanted to refer to the manuscripts over there. Some of the rarest manuscripts were preserved in Sharda Peeth. If you want the most original manuscript. So we have the example of Ramanujacharya, who travelled all the way from Tamil Nadu to Kashmir, to Sharda Peeth, because he wanted to, before he wrote his commentary on the Brahma Sutra, he wanted to refer to all the books available there. So imagine that. We also have example of Hemachandra of Gujarat, who was asked by the king to write a book on grammar, a new book on grammar, Vyakarna. So he wanted all the old books on grammar which have been written until now, and those were only available in Sharda Peeth. So the king arranged for those copies to be made and brought to Gujarat. So you can see what it was like. And then in southern India, you can see Kanchipuram, Tirunendravarur, Tirumukku, Kadukudal, and so many, Ennairam, Nagapattinam. All of these are actually temples, mathas, where education was also being conducted. So because learning was sacred, so obviously temples where we worship Devi or any Devi or Devata, that could also be used as a center for learning. It was just as a natural outcome of it. Temples would expand to include halls like this, where the gurus would come and they would talk to everybody, and anyone can come and listen to them. Also, debates would take place in the temples. Okay. In the western part of India, the most famous was Vallavi. Now, all these did not exist at the same time, but I have plotted them together. They existed at different times, so you know that you have to make that adjustment. Vallabhi University was in the west, and it was set up by two professors from Nalanda. Stiramati and Gunamati were told to go to the western part of India and set up a university as good as Nalanda. So that's how they went and did that. And the interesting thing about this Vallabhi University was that it was teaching administration, management, finance, all that was taught. And there is a reference in Katha Sarit Sagara in which there is a father who is saying that I am sending my son to study in Vallabhi. Now this is interesting because he is in the Gangetic Plain. He lives in Uttar Pradesh. But he is saying I want to send my son to study in Vallabhi, western part of India. So this gives you an idea of how much people traveled for education. So it's not today's phenomenon that people are traveling far off to IITs to study, right? Even in those times, can you imagine 2000 years ago, parents are inspiring their children to study in the best universities and those students are working hard because there is no guarantee that if they go there, they get admission. So there used to be these very difficult entrance examinations which were, in the case of Nalanda, we hear that only 20% students would clear the entrance examination and 80% had to be turned away. And even if they came from China, they came from very far off countries, Indonesia, the meritocracy rules were so strict that if you are not able to answer correctly, then they would be turned away. Because there are so many good people applying, so obviously they can't take the second best and third best. And we hear of coaching centers where if you could, in order to clear the entrance exam for these renowned universities, you could get coaching. And they used to spring up near those universities and the villages, the houses of the scholars would serve as those coaching centers. That's also not a new phenomenon. So many things you think they are modern phenomena, they're actually ancient. India has already dealt with them. For example, these summer courses, spring courses, we also had that. We had the short courses, Varshika, Vasantika, those were a few, 1 month course. So if you don't want to do the whole 8 years of study of medicine or Shastras, you can do a short course. So that was done. And I also want to mention the Kantalur Shala University in Kerala. We keep talking about Nalanda. I also want to highlight some of the lesser known universities like Kantalur Shala was called the Nalanda of the South. And it is mentioned in many scriptures that even from North India, northern part of India, they were going to Kerala to study in Kantalur Shala because it offered many more subjects. You could also learn martial arts. You know that Kerala is known for martial arts. Martial arts can be studied along with Shastras. So if you go into the history of Kantalur Shala, it's very interesting. There are instructions on how students cannot go to the classroom wearing their weapons, carrying their weapons, because sometimes there will be fights between the students in the class. So they said, leave all your weapons outside the classroom before you go. So these interesting things about Indian universities, it just makes you realize that we just don't know enough. We don't have pride in what we had, right? So India had a very ancient tradition of formal discipline, teaching and learning, and they were very profound rites of passage. Ceremonies which chose you. The ceremonies were all linked to education. Many of them, out of the so many samskaras, you find that a lot of them are linked to education. One of them is Vidyarambha, where the first time the child learns how to read or just traces the alphabet for the first time in a ceremony. It would be done in a very beautiful, graceful manner. Then Upanayana, which you all know, when the child would go into higher learning and would move to a Gurukula, live with a Guru for the next 8 to 12 years. Then there was Samavartana, which was the graduation ceremony, and that also was so profound and so beautiful. The shlokas that were chanted in the Samavartana, mostly from the Taittiriya Upanishad. And if you learn about that, you will feel like today's graduation ceremonies are nothing. They are just a pale shadow of the kind of elaborate ceremonies we used to have, right? So in Samavartana, so many shlokas are chanted to tell where the student is taking the oath that he will carry forward the knowledge that his Guru has imparted. It is his runa. This is a debt that he has, he owes to the Guru. Guru has spent so much time teaching the student, and now the student's responsibility is to continue it and have more students. meritorious students. So that all came out in those ceremonies. There was enormous value attached to education. Everybody knew that living in avidya is bad. Ignorance is not good. And even the poor people, they knew that to the extent possible they must educate their children. So even today I find that Indian children everywhere in the world, their parents are pushing them to study hard, to be at the top. You will find Indian parents will not rejoice if their children get into some ordinary university. Even today it's very funny. In Facebook I will see that if the child did not get into an Ivy League university, the top university, the parents will not even write about it. Whereas I've seen the white, the typical American white mothers, they are very happy when their child gets into any college. They say, oh, my child got into some useless college, but they're still very happy. But for Indians, they did not get into Yale, did not get into Harvard, it's no use. But that kind of pushiness, I feel it comes from that long tradition we have where we want our children to get into the best universities. We want that Nalanda scholar, Ujjain scholar. Ujjain was a center of mathematics and astronomy. So the top math students of ancient India would go to study in Ujjain because the top math scholars will be teaching there. Okay. So I say that the modern universities today, they are built on the intellectual foundation laid by the Gurukulas, Mathas and Viharas. So we should recognize the debt that we owe to them. So this is a picture of Hate Khodi ceremony. Hate Khodi, which is the Vidyarambha ceremony that I mentioned, the first time a child traces an alphabet. So this is done during Saraswati Puja. So I'm sure a few days ago, yesterday I think was Saraswati Puja, 2 days ago, you would have found in Bengal definitely, lots and lots of children would have done this. First time that they trace the alphabets on the slate. So see how they celebrate that you're able to start your journey of learning. And the fact that we celebrate it like a ceremony, you will not find this in other civilizations. Maybe you found it in the ancient ones which are no more, but it is definitely not something celebrated the way we were doing it. The other thing I want to emphasize is the role of the teacher in society. The teacher was the most important person in society. So today when we say that, we complain that teachers are not getting their due, they should be the highest paid in the society. They are the ones who are creating the citizens of the future. Why are they not paid the highest? Why are they paid the least? Well, and then they say, look at Finland. Finland is, paying the teachers so well, taking care of teachers. And I laugh and tell them that, instead of giving the Finland example, give the Indian example itself, ancient Indian example, where the teacher was at the top. Anywhere a teacher walked, you will find that people are coming and doing pranam because, oh my God, this teacher is spending his life in educating. And teachers typically led a very austere life. They could not be living in mansions, wearing very ornate clothes. They led very simple lives. So that's why they were respected. And the entire society supported scholars emotionally, financially, and when there were ceremonies, like even today you see the ceremonies where you're told to invite scholars and give them food. They say Brahmins you have to give food, but what they mean is actually scholars. Students, scholars, whenever you do any puja, try to invite them and give them food. This is your way of getting punya. And even in the 18th, 19th century, right down to, I think, the last century as well, there was a custom where in the villages, any puja is being performed in any house, a part of the prasad will be kept to give to the schoolmaster. So a thali will be sent to the schoolmaster's house. From every house, whenever they do a puja, they'll keep something for the teacher. This is the same custom which has come from thousands of years. And then the kings, they donated land for building gurukulas. So the kings used to take note whenever they heard about some very well-known guru who is doing good work. They would give land because that land can be, the produce from that land can feed the students. Typically the guru has to take care of all the needs of the student. Food has to be given, enough food. And so the grain, everything grown on that land will be used for the matha or the pachal. That was the culture. And so the seekers of knowledge were freed from the burden of earning a livelihood. So once you got into the path of learning and studies, they don't have to worry where the food will come from, where the medicines will come from if they fall sick, because society was bound to help them. Okay? And there was the concept of bhiksha. So Bhiksha is where the student can knock at the door of any house and say, give me food, give me Bhiksha. And whatever the householder will give, usually the lady of the house, he has to manage with that. Can't say, I want this, I want that, he can't make demands. Whatever is given, that is the food that he has to eat. Now this is to bring humility. This Bhiksha cannot be translated as begging. A lot of people say Bhiksha means begging. So actually even when I went to Myanmar, I went to Burma, and all these Buddhist scholars, I saw them on the road, they were all carrying a bowl and they were doing exactly the same thing. Even today the Buddhist people follow this, the Buddhist monks. And the driver was telling me that they're going for begging. I said, please don't call it begging, this is Bhiksha. So he was saying, oh, you know Bhikka. So he was very surprised. I said, it has come from our country, so I know about it. So this is the thing, that when Buddha became Buddha, I mean he was earlier Siddhartha. So when Buddha went back to his parents' house after he got this nirvana, when he went back to his parents' house, he stayed with his father in the palace, but every morning he would go for Bhiksha. And his father was very embarrassed. He said, why are you doing this? You are now, you're the son of a king. How can you go and beg? He said, no, this is the way to, it doesn't matter who I am. Every monk has to do this. So he started this practice that you have to go and get whatever the society gives you. So this is a very amazing practice. The way it brings humility, because even the sons of kings, when they went to Gurukulas, when they went to study, the sons of rich people, they would have to go and ask for Bhiksha. So I always like to say that, the thinkers of ancient India like Kanada, Sushruta, Charaka, Aryabhatta, Varahamira, Brahmagupta, Bhaskaracharya, Panini, Patanjali, Pingala, Bharata, and hundreds of others, they laid the foundational imprint of every discipline that we are studying today. I always like to, it's not a sweeping assertion. If you actually go into the sciences, medicine, math, language, art, music, philosophy, any of the disciplines that are being taught in universities today, if you go back and find out when was it first studied as a subject and who gave the initial concepts, you will find that it leads back to India. This can be said with conviction, and we really owe a debt to all these gurus that are mentioned, and there must be many, many more, because they were not supposed to be touting their achievements and showing off what they knew. These are some of the names that we have of the gurus, but there must have been thousands of others, because there is no other way we could have been the knowledge capital of the world if the gurus had not done that. A little earlier I spoke about the mobility of scholars of ancient India. So traveling was an important part of education, especially those who studied medicine. We have ample evidence of those who completed the Vaidya training. They would travel around India. They had to treat patients in different parts of the country and see how they respond to the medications. So practical training was a very important part of learning, and that meant that they would travel. And traveling was important because it would give them it would make them tougher. So the sons of rich men, son of industrialists and all that, when they would travel around the country after finishing their education, they would sleep on the floor. It might be cold sometimes, it might be hot sometimes, there might be mosquitoes. So they had to adjust to all these things, and traveling was an important part of education. And I already told you how Vallabhi was set up by the Nalanda professors. The other things, surprising things that I came to know about was how scholars went to different parts of India and set up the universities over there. For example, Mithila University, we all know about Mithila in Bihar. That was a huge center of learning. Logic was taught there. Tarka Shastra that was taught in the Mithila school was very famous. When I went a little deeper, I found that the whole Mithila, the flourishing of Mithila happened when it was under the rule of a Nanya Deva, a king called Nanya Deva. And when I tried to find out where Nanya Deva came from, he was from Karnataka. So from Karnataka, a young person has become the king of Mithila, and Mithila is flourishing as a center of learning, but there is no Kannada that is being taught there. It is still the language of the people there which is being taught. And Maithili, of course, is a very beautiful language, the language of poetry. So it was a Karnataka dynasty that brought out the whole glory of the Mithila culture. And similarly, I come from a family which came from northern India. So in my family, we trace our ancestors to Ahitchatra which is close to Bareilly, Uttar Pradesh. So there was a king in Karnataka called Mayur Varma. And Mayur Varma was very intent on developing this whole region as a center of learning and scholarship. So he kept inviting scholars from northern India and they came from Ahitchatra. So Ahitchatra must have been a huge center of learning. I have plotted Ahitchatra on that map also. So some 60 scholars came in one batch and my ancestors came from those 60 families. So we are called Arvatoklu. Arvatoklu means those 60 families that came from Ahitchatra. Then when I went and read the history of Mayur Varma, I came to know in another batch got 300 families. So these are all scholars well versed in different subjects like Vyakarna. My ancestors were mostly all Vyakarna Pandits. My grandfather, great-grandfather, if you go back, they were all Vyakarna Pandits. So that's how knowledge used to be passed on. So this king has got all these scholars, top scholars in different disciplines to come and settle down in Karnataka, and then he gave them land so that they could teach the people in Karnataka. So this was the culture of the land where for the kings used to do so much for progressing the learning in that region. Just to give you a glimpse of how, the way we approached different subjects, Indian grammarians turned language also into science. So those of you who have studied Sanskrit, you know how the alphabets have been arranged, right? And by Sanskrit, every Indian language, the way we have arranged the alphabets, there's a science behind it. So when we study English, we just learn A, B, C, D, E, F, G, there's no logic in the way those alphabets are arranged. But when you look at the way any Indian language is taught or Sanskrit is taught, you realize the gurus, the way they thought, the logical way in which they thought. So we have like ka, kha, ga, gha, nya, right? It comes from the throat. It's called kantya, right? They're also called gutturals. Later on, all these concepts went to Europe. In the 18th century, when the European scholars came into contact with our languages, they took these concepts. So cha, cha, ja, ja, nya, right? Talavya, they come from the palate. Ta, tha, da, da, na, murdhanya. Ta, tha, da, da, na, dantya. So the way we are pronouncing it, and finally what we pronounce from the lips, the oshtya, pa, 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 ma, and that is the way. This is just a glimpse of how we even approach language. It was not like humanities will not have science and only science subjects will have scientific thinking. Everything was approached in a very scientific manner. And this is just one example of that. And this influenced linguistics, the whole study of linguistics that came later from the 18th century onwards. It came from the contact of the Europeans with the Sanskrit language. Now you'll probably be surprised to know that you of course know that India gave the decimal system, they gave 0 to the world, but you probably don't know the resistance that it was met with in Europe when the Arabic scholars took the Indian number system. A lot of scholars from India went and settled in Baghdad. They used to be invited. And that's how Brahmagupta's works, Brahmasputa Siddhanta, and so many other works were all translated to Arabic and Persian. And that's how the Arabic world came to know about the Indian number system. So prior to that, you know that how the Romans used to write numbers, right? They used to have different letters. They had to keep inventing newer and newer alphabets to represent the number. So L was 50, C was 100, century 100. And the largest number was M for myriad. So the word, we use that expression myriad, right? That means many. So M stood for 1,000. And imagine a number like 3898 was written as this long number, MMMDCCC. So this is the way they conceptualize numbers. So today we have taken it for granted. We all use the decimal system. But just imagine the time when nobody was using it in the rest of the world, and India came up with this thinking that we should use numerals from 0 to 9 in order to represent any number. It can be as large as you want it, but we can use just these 10 numerals and we can represent any number. It was a mind-boggling discovery, and when it first was taken up by the Arabs loved it, they took it, and they called it the Indian number system. The whole subject of mathematics was called Hindistan because it came from Hindustan. And you will find that a lot of works written by Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Kindi, so many Arabic scholars, they give credit to India because it came from Hindustan. And then came a period when it was taken to Europe, when the Christian Europe conquered the Islamic territories, and all that knowledge was transferred to Europe. They translated everything to Latin, and that is the time they did give credit to India. That's how the Indian source was wiped out at that time. So let me tell you this funny fight that happened. So the Christian Europe was calling the Arabic, they called it the Arabic numbers, which were of course the Indian numbers. They were calling it infidel numbers, and they didn't want it. They said they wanted to stick with their way of writing numbers, like like XX for 20 and things like that. They didn't want all these infidel numbers as they called them. And the other interesting thing is this picture that you're seeing is but it took 200 years for them to accept this decimal system, and there's a competition going on between the abacus. You know abacus? Some of you might know abacus, right? Where you use those beads to do addition and subtraction. And they used to do addition and subtraction by using the abacus, right? And they did not want to accept the decimal system where within a few minutes you can do so many big calculations. So there was a competition between the algorist and the abacus. Algorists were the ones using the Indian number system. Of course, they claimed that it came from Arabia. So it comes from this guy. Al-Khwarizmi only comes from him. So imagine that competition, and then finally the algorist won, and that's how the decimal system won after 200 years of competition. So it's only around the 14th, 15th century that the Indian number system was accepted. And as you know, even today, nothing has changed. It's the same way that even today we are calculating, we are using numbers, right? Nothing has changed. So it's not a small contribution that India has made to the world, which is not recognized. Now, games were also used as educational aids. So apart from the regular courses, degree courses that were taught, Vikramshila, by the way, was the first one to award a certificate at the end of completion of a course. So apart from all the formal learning, we also had a lot of games that were used in education. So this is the most popular example, which is a game of snakes and ladders. The modern version just has numbers on it, and if you land on any number which has a ladder, you go up, and if you land on a number with a snake, you come down. But the way the Indians used to play this game was that every square had some vice or a virtue on it. So, if you landed on a square with Kama, Krodha, then you would come down a snake. But if you landed on a square with Dharma, right, something good, Daya, then you would go up a ladder to a higher number. And the last number would be Moksha or Vaikuntha or something like that. So in this way, the children who were playing games like this, they were getting value education without any lecturing. They already knew that this is good, this is bad, and it was already hardwired into them. And this is just one example. We also had chess. We had playing cards. Playing cards came from India. And playing cards can be used for so many things. You can teach permutation, combination. You can teach so many things with playing cards. And with chess also, strategy. It was a part of education of people from the royal family. They all had to know how to play chess well, because that's how you think 10 moves ahead, 15 moves ahead. So games being used as education is a very innovative concept that came from India. Stories were used as educational aids. We all know how Ramayana, Mahabharata, we have so many stories. So even mathematical problems sometimes used to be given in story fashion. That is the way it went. Panchatantra was very deep. It was actually Niti Shastra, which was taught in the form of these interesting stories. So children would be knowing the Panchatantra stories, which were teaching them various concepts. And when they went on to study Niti Shastra in higher centers of learning, they would immediately relate to it because they've already learned it in story form in Panchatantra. So they could immediately feel that familiarity with those deep concepts of Niti Shastra. So look at the way education has been structured, right? Then we had a culture of debate. There are numerous references to Tarka Shastra, Vada Vidya. You will find it mentioned in Ramayana, Mahabharata, Skanda Purana, Yagnavalkya Samhita, Chandogya Upanishad. It was very, very important to look at everything from a logical perspective and find out the reasons why it is happening. And that is why we were able to go deep into so many things. You will find it in Ayurveda, for instance, how well they have found out the connection between different organisms, between different organs. And even the fact that the left brain and the right brain, the fact that they do different things was already figured out by them too. You find the reference to that. And the kings were very fond of organizing debate tournaments. So in the Roman world, you hear about gladiators and big those big tournaments where you find two warriors killing each other, or animal versus human competitions. But we used to love debate tournaments. So when you go and look into the famous debates that have taken place in history, you'll find that it's so deeply embedded. We had various terms for debate. Debate was not random. It was studied in a very technical, very structured way, and there were rules on debate, how you will lose a debate if you resort to evasion, if you change the final, the purpose of the principle, the proposition that you are making. If you change the proposition, then you will get minus points. So all these things were written in books, and more and more scholars would come and write more on that. They would write commentaries. They would disagree with other scholars and say, I think we need to simplify this further. And then pramanas, like you had all those great debates between Advaita and Dvaita. And it was all about pramana. What is a good pramana? What is a bad pramana? And pratyaksha pramana, which is what can you discard? And then whose evidence? So, it's just so wonderful when you look at it, that today when you see the debates that are held, say the TV debates and all, they're just so low level compared to what we had in ancient times. In fact, all of these people would be disqualified, that you see today, the way they debate. Our acharyas would have just kicked them out of the stage because they are just not following any of those rules. They are just randomly giving any pramana, and then they are not giving references for it. All that would not be accepted. So, and the other thing is that the winners of debates would be taken around the city in chariots for everybody to see. This has been mentioned in certain stories, and that shows to you that when the common people look at these people being taken around, then they know that they are the role models. They need to be like these great people, the way they talk, they explain, they use very good language, the finer points they explain with beautiful similes. So this is how the role models were being set for society. All this played a role in making our society so focused on education. Then the importance of memory training. I have a whole chapter in my book on memory training, because today we are dismissing a lot of things as rote learning, and yes, justifiably so, because somehow we dumbed down our education to the point that it became rote learning. But in ancient India, memory training was given a lot of importance. You were required to remember entire books. I mean, it was very commonplace for someone to remember the entire Ashtadhyayi. The Ashtadhyayi, the Vyakarna book with 4,000 rules on grammar. They just had to remember it, and they would chant it, and then they would find out whether a sentence is constructed properly or not, or those kind of things. And today we find that there have been studies that show that there is a superior learning curve when your memory is enhanced. So if you are able to retain a lot of things that you have studied, then it improves your cognition. This has been proven today. And so what we had was actually a good practice. Now, Yi Jing, the Chinese student who came to India, has written about the huge memories of Indians. He, of course, mentioned Brahmanas' memories are huge, but then British people have mentioned the memories of ordinary people like the dhobi, the pharmacist. The dhobi will remember which house he has brought the clothes from, and he says, I've never seen this kind of phenomenal memory. And then for the medicines, if you go to get some medicines, the pharmacist knows where that medicine is kept for which illness, and he takes it out in a second. Even though the whole wall is full of shelves with the medicines, he knows exactly where what is kept. So these are the ordinary. Kerala School of Mathematics, you might have heard of how there were a lot of Kerala mathematicians who were flourishing in the 14th century or so. And even in that place also, people had phenomenal memories. They just remembered everything. And today, when you look at the memories that we have, I think it's very disturbing. Most of us, we do not remember even the mobile numbers of maybe more than 2 or 3 people, right? And if something was to happen and there's a solar flare and all our data is destroyed, we probably won't even remember our address. We have become we've dumbed down to that extent that we don't remember anything. So I feel that we need to look towards the Veda Pathshalas and see if there is something we can learn. So Veda, when they memorized the Veda, they had 11 different ways in which they memorized the Veda. Okay? And so it was not just by repeating the same thing day after day that they were memorizing things. That's just a terrible way of memorizing. So we actually had important techniques whereby memory could be enhanced. So, we had the Samhita Patha, Pada Patha, Krama Patha. These are all the different ways in which the Vedic mantras were chanted. So, A, B, B, C. So, if A is one word and B is the second word and C is the third word in that whole series. So, A, B, B, C, C, D. This is the Krama Patha way of chanting. Then Jata Patha would have A, B, B, A, B, B, C, C, B, B, C, C, D, and so on. Shikha Patha, Dvaja Patha, and the hardest was Ghana Patha. Last one, Ghana Patha, when you see A, B, B, A, A, B, C, C, B, A, A, B, C. So this non-uniform way of learning used to enhance the memory. So our educators, ancient educators, knew that if you give a certain pattern to the chanting, then they will remember it. And of course, later on, musical intonations were added. All those things were done. But these are the memory techniques that we have simply discarded today in our education. We don't care for it. But it used to be very important. And even if you learn, or Bhagavad Gita, for example, let's say you have learned the Bhagavad Gita completely, you will find a lot of use to it. At critical moments in your life, those mantras, those shlokas will come to your mind and it will help you to cope, right? So this was helping in that way also. There was no artificial divide between religion and science, So in our case, in the process of doing a havan, we were actually connecting to mathematics, right? Because we wanted to draw the perfect square, rectangle, triangle, in doing all those shapes, and the yantras had to be made. So there was nothing there. It was not like when you're talking about religion, there has to be no math in it. So it was all very integrated. Auspicious timings for rituals. So you see how our religion was actually leading to mathematics. So in order to perform the yajna at the right time, they had to know where the stars would be. So they had to, that's how the astronomical rules probably came about. It has been surmised that in doing our religious ceremonies, we actually became better and better in mathematics. Now, contrast this with Europe, where religion and science had a huge fight. You already saw how they rejected the decimal system because they said it is infidel numbers. So it is not. They were also in the Islamic world. They rejected negative numbers because they said it's evil. Negative numbers, because what you cannot see, how can you study that? Because you can't see anything negative, right? You can see positive areas, but what is this negative thing? So they just rejected it. But in India, we had no such problem. Religion and science and maths, everything was together. Poetry, everything was integrated. So math and poetry, right? Bhaskaracharya, the famous mathematician, many people regard him as the greatest mathematician ever, Bhaskaracharya. And he was an ace poet. When he wrote the Leelavati and various other texts, it's high quality poetry. You can study it just for the poetry. But then he's actually giving you mathematical problems. And Leelavati is an interesting book because it is written for a girl, a beautiful woman. So you will find a lot of references to, oh, beautiful one, can you solve this problem? And this right away tells you that girls are also getting educated. Right? So I made this graphic just to show the relevance of India's educational heritage. What is the relevance for today? And I just made some points here, like civilizational pride, reservoir of wisdom, ideas for today's challenges, holistic approach to the world, character building, uniqueness. So let me just elaborate on these things. So I think civilizational pride is something that is missing in our education today. That needs to be brought. because it is also now a part of NEP, the National Education Policy 2020 mentions it. It says there is a need for rootedness and pride in India and its rich, diverse, ancient and modern culture and knowledge systems. So you see, most of the ancient civilizations are no more today. Mesopotamian, Iranian, the Persian, where are they? Sumerian. I mean, we don't even know what language they had. It's all gone, it's replaced by different religions where the whole culture has been wiped out. We are the only living continuous civilization. We are still doing those ceremonies, we are still chanting things which were written thousands of years ago. So that is something to be proud of, because a lot of these Shastras contain knowledge which is very, very relevant even for today. They are forever, they are relevant forever. Right? And I think pride is healthy. If you look at certain countries, they are actually manufactured pride. There are countries like I was in America where I live. They have some 100-year-old building and they're telling people to be proud of it, and that 100-year-old building, and I'm just laughing. So they are forcibly creating something to be proud of, whereas we don't have to do anything. All we have to do is just to go back and study what we did, and that pride will come. So I think it's very important for us as individuals to become confident in our skill. We need to know our past so that we develop pride. And I always say that being rooted in your civilization makes you authentic. It brings out the real you. You come to know who you are, and it makes you confident, relaxed, comfortable. I like to quote Raghav Krishna, who says that being authentic means aligning your svabhava with swadharma. So when your svabhava and swadharma come together, that is when you become authentic, the most authentic version of yourself. And when you're authentic, it also helps with your relationships. They become very meaningful, right? With your family, with your colleagues. So when you connect to your history, to your shastras, to your civilization, you will connect to the real you. Because we have been colonized. We know in our history we have been invaded, we have been colonized, and we are no longer thinking with our original drishti. That drishti is gone. So that's why it's important to connect to it. And here is a picture of Sridhar Vembu. Sridhar Vembu, who is the founder of Zoho Corporation, and he went to the US to study. He got his degrees. He started this company called Zoho. And then there came that moment for him also when he suddenly connected to his civilization and connected to his roots. So he moved back to Tamil Nadu and decided to live among the villagers. And he said, for my company, I'm going to get villagers. These villagers, I'm going to train them so that they can become employees in my company. And so he's on a drive to train thousands of village people. He's ensuring that they keep their samskaras, everything intact, and they don't go through this modern education system which simply divorces them from their civilization. And he's training them to root programming and various other things along with Sanskrit learning. And he's employing them. And he lives in the village. He goes by cycle, he goes in a bicycle. In the morning he goes for a walk and he swims in the village pond. And he's very happy. He says, I'm in the happiest phase of my life. When he wants to have a conference meeting, he does it in the open. His house is all built in the open architecture style. So this is what I mean by connecting to your roots. People think that if you go back to your past, what will you do? How will you be successful? Well, how are these people being successful? Right? We have role models. I like to put this quote from Michael Crichton, who wrote Jurassic Park. He said, if you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You are a leaf that doesn't know that it is part of a tree. So when you don't know your civilization, you are like a leaf that is floating around. You don't even know that you came from this big tree. So that is one big reason why we need to connect to our history and our civilization. The new discourse of decoloniality. Now in America, there's a big section of people from Africa and from Latin America. They're all insisting that we need to decolonize ourselves. We have been colonized and we are not proud of our culture and we don't even know what our culture was. So we need to decolonize. So this has become a whole branch of study in American universities. But surprisingly, Indians are not doing anything in decolonization. So that's also one thing that I want to tell students, that when you study your heritage, also get into the decoloniality discourse. Okay? Decoloniality challenges European universalism. It rejects the notion that we must look at the world from the European perspective. So we have all been subconsciously conditioned by the education system, which has come from the British, that we don't look at things from our perspective, we look at it from the Western perspective. The doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery was an actual doctrine which was promulgated by the Pope in the 15th century, and that gave the justification for colonization. So they said that they gave a framework for Christian explorers like Columbus to lay claim on territories. So once they claim the territory, it belongs to them. And anything that is seen by them for the first time or discovered by them for the first time, it comes in their name. The credit for discovering that goes to them. So never mind if Native Americans are using some medicine for thousands of years. If the European guy comes across it, then he is the discoverer of that medicine. So this is an actual doctrine. And that is why, Newton, Leibniz, Dalton, Louis Pasteur, they're all given credit for things that they didn't discover. It was already in use. It was already known to India or in various other indigenous civilizations. But the credit will be given to the European. So that is the European doctrine of discovery, and that is why we need to decolonize. So I want to give you some examples of how we have lost terminology because of colonization. I don't know if you have heard of non-sleep deep rest. Non-sleep deep rest. I think last year I saw Sundar Pichai. He's an Indian. He's a CEO of Google. And he's recommending that, I was not getting sleep, so I tried non-sleep deep rest. It's very, very useful. Now, NSDR is nothing but Yoga Nidra. Yoga Nidra, which is conventionally taught as part of yoga, if you go deep into a yoga training. So that is Yoga Nidra. And now it has been given a new name, it is patented, and you have to call it NSDR. These are the dangers of us not being connected to our culture and heritage, right? Alternate nostril breathing is pranayama. Imagine, pranayama is no longer being called pranayama, it's called alternate nostril breathing, and it's sounding like something that has come from the West. And of course, there are yoga teachers. Yoga itself is no longer an Indian concept. It is only thanks to recent times when we have that International Yoga Day that somehow India is being brought into the discourse. Otherwise, yoga is just some universal knowledge system, and we don't have to know where it came from, right? This Uthak Baithak, that is another interesting thing. Uthak Baithak, or I think Toppu Karanam or something they call in Tamil, where the punishment that used to be given to naughty children in school, when you hold the ears and you go up and down, right? There used to be, I still remember that naughty children were asked to stand outside and do that, holding the ears and going up and down. That is now being projected as super brain yoga. Super brain yoga, because they have found studies that show how children who are, hyperactive, who have hyperactivity disorder, when they do this Uthak Baithak, then it clears it up and they become calm and stable. So this is now super brain yoga. Systems approach. All these terms that Europe has given to the world, and we are all using it, we didn't lay claim to it. We didn't say that it came from our culture, and that is the mistake we made. Systems approach is Purusha approach. If you look at our Shastras, everything is in terms of Purusha. So this temple architecture is built like an organism, like a Purusha was lying on the ground. Any organization is like a Purusha, like there is a head, right? There are the arms, there are the thighs, and there are the feet. The people at the lowest level, the ones who do the actual work, they are, in every company it's like that. So Purusha approach was used everywhere, but today it's called systems approach. So that's why I feel that when we connect to our history and our Sanskrit and different languages, we must make sure that we are also getting hold of the terminology. We should be giving terminology to the West. So when I was working for a water magazine called Asian Water, and there was a big ceremony in which they launched One Water. One fine day they came up with this term called One Water, in which they explained that the same water that we are drinking is the water drunk by animals, it is drunk by, absorbed by plants, and also the river needs its own water to flow. So we must take all this into consideration and we must call it One Water. So I was sitting in the audience and I said, what is new about this? This is what we in India have been known about. We always regarded that every resource in environment is meant for everybody. We all have to share it. It was always integrated water management for us. So they said, well, you didn't give the terms for it. We are now giving the term for it. So they were right. So that's one thing that we need to think about. Now this is a infographic in my book in which I have shown how Indian knowledge went to the rest of the world. It's the longest chapter in my book wherein I have given all the references about how Indian scholars went to, say, China, how hundreds of scholars went to China and they translated our manuscripts to Chinese, and that's how the Department of Astronomy was set up in China, various other departments. So this is very, very important. We should know how Indian knowledge traveled to the rest of the world. And medicine is one place. We started with medicine because in the spice route we all talk about how Indian spices were being exported to the rest of the world. Well, actually half of them were medicines. So they were the Ayurvedic herbs that were being grown in India, and they used to be taken to the rest of the world. They would be purchased. Then I have talked about arithmetic, algebra, geometry, how it went to Europe. You see, in Europe there was a place called Toledo, which was a huge center of translation. So the way Indian knowledge went to the rest of the world is through translation. It was literally a translation revolution. So the Chinese scholars who came to India, there was a competition between them about how many manuscripts they can carry with them. So Xuanzang he took 600 manuscripts. Someone else took 400 manuscripts. So they were all like, I have got so many hundreds of manuscripts from India. So, and they would be given credit for that. Like, wow, you got so many manuscripts. So it was all about get as many manuscripts as you can and translate them and enhance the knowledge of that region. So India has contributed hugely in that way, just by sheer translation. So Sushruta Samhita, Charaka Samhita, all these were translated into Latin. And a lot of mistakes were made in translation, by the way. In mathematics, a lot of mistakes were made. And sometimes they would not understand the term and they would think that this refers to a human being and then call that, he's the inventor of that, all that, and without knowing that it's just a term, it's not referring to some human being, it's a technique. So a lot of errors in translation also happen. But slowly, knowledge spread. 7 notes of music went from India. Then the atomic theory, you look at Kanada's theory, he has already given the fundamentals of the atomic theory, which came later. So the foundations were all there. Gynecology, obstetrics. In China, a lot of these, we say that Buddhism went from India to China, but it was actually not just Buddhism, because in the Buddhist texts, there was a lot of knowledge of medicine in it, there was also mathematics in it. So actually it was just knowledge of every kind that was going. And so there is an example of a monastery in China where some monk from India gave them a manuscript on gynecology. And then that was translated to Chinese. And then the monks over there started treating the women patients who had gynecological problems, pregnancy issues. And that monastery became very famous for reproductive health and female health. Okay? So this is how, our books would reach some land, get translated, and then help people of that area with that knowledge. Okay? All the details are in my book. Now, knowing your heritage helps to connect the dots. And to illustrate that, I have this example of the number 108. We all know the number 108 is very sacred, right? When we do japa, we chant it for 108 times. Devi Stuti also, there is this 108 times you have to chant the Devi's names. And a lot of us think that it's some rubbish number, it has come from nowhere. 108 times flowers, 108 flowers in a mala, all these things. Now, recently it was found out that 108 is the ratio of the diameter of the sun and diameter of the earth. So the sun is 108 times the diameter of the earth. The distance between the earth and the sun is 108 times the diameter of the sun. The distance between the earth and the moon is 108 times the moon's diameter. So you see this number keeps coming again and again in astronomy. And that's how probably, we realize that it's some magic number. There is some mystic significance to it, and maybe that's how it came into the Japa Mala and all that, right? So a lot of things that we dismiss as nonsense or superstition in our culture, we actually need to investigate and find out whether there is some scientific basis to it. And many times you will find it, right? Now, I also say that we must reconnect with our ancient knowledge because classical texts may provide new ideas and solutions for the modern world. Maybe there is some miracle drug lying there waiting to be discovered when you connect to that text, when you learn Sanskrit and read the text in the original, there is something amazing, some concept that is waiting to be discovered. Now we have the example of Manjul Bhargava. You might have heard of him. He won the Fields Medal, the highest award in mathematics, the Fields Medal. And if you look at what he did, he actually took a lot of inspiration from India. Because he used to come to Jaipur, where his grandfather lived, and he would spend the entire summer holidays with him. He learned Sanskrit. He read a lot of books written in the original, by Brahmagupta, Bhaskaracharya. He read them, Pingala. And that's how he came up with a new way to prove Gauss's law on binary quadratic forms. So he found a very elegant way of proving it in the manner that the ancient mathematicians of India solved problems. So he took inspiration from that. So I say that, this is a clear example of how somebody took ancient knowledge and used it for today, right? Ayurvedic concoctions, yoga are being repurposed to treat diseases. There's a potential in agriculture. A lot of our agricultural practices were so sensible, were so leading to good produce that, it's shameful that we have just discarded them. Water management, sanitation, architecture, construction, cooking. There are all these streams of knowledge, Indian knowledge systems, that we should be mining for using today, for at least getting new concepts or building up on it. And I love to give this quote by Einstein. Right? Einstein said that you cannot solve problems with the same thinking used to create the problems. And when you look at today's problems, right? What are today's biggest problems? We have global warming, climate change, we have trash building up, landfills, right? Pollution of rivers, pollution of the air, breakdown of society, psychological problems. When you look at all these problems, was it created with the Indian mindset? Did these problems come from the thinking of ancient India? No, it has come from the modern mindset, the modern education system, which has been there, the Western education system, that has created all these problems. So that tells you that we need to, that's why change our mindset and go back to our Indian way of thinking. The traditional Indic approach is always holistic. They predate the words of integrated and interdisciplinary. All these things actually were just routine, very commonplace in India. So in Ayurveda itself, in the very beginning, the Charaka says that if you know only your own subject, you are not going to be a good Vaidya. You have to know something about all the other subjects, other shastras, other disciplines. Then you will be a good doctor, which is already interdisciplinary thinking that we are taught today. Right? Then there was no separate subject of environmental sciences in ancient India. Why was that? Because everything was nature-centered. That's the way it was. You would not build something which is going to lead to cutting of a lot of trees, which is going to destroy the forest, destroy the species forever. This thing was not done. So, it was just inbuilt in our education system. So, being connected with Indian Shastras will inculcate holistic thinking. We can see beyond our body, our state, country, boundaries, and reflect on the connected systems. We are all about connectivity. We are always thinking about if this happens. In Ramayana, there's a story, I don't know if you have paid attention to that. Bharata, when he comes to persuade Rama to come back to the kingdom, right? He doesn't, he comes with his whole army and everything, but he makes them stand outside the periphery of the forest where Rama is staying, and then he comes to him and tries to persuade him, and he says, I didn't bring the whole army inside because they would destroy the forest. So see the kind of thinking that was there, right then. Brahmacharya, I don't know if am I taking too much time? Just let me quickly talk about Brahmacharya because that was a very important part of education. Today, Brahmacharya is not a part of education. I think that has led to huge flaws in our society. So, Brahmacharya was about discipline. It was about exercising control on every aspect of life. Food, sleep, thought, sexual enjoyment. Because it was not considered sinful. Because, Grihastha, yes, that was the period to enjoy the sexual union. But the period of Brahmacharya was one where you should not be wasting your energy. Because when you waste your energy in all these things, then you will not focus enough on your learning. So that was the thing that was taught. So during the student period, the brahmacharya training would give them that strong self-control. So they know that now they should not be sleeping for 10 hours, 12 hours. They have to wake up with sunrise. They have to wind up by sunset. All these things were already part of brahmacharya. So if that, I feel we can find a way of bringing that in our education system, then the later problems that come in life, like you get addicted to something, or you get into anger, rage issues, all these things will be sorted out if brahmacharya is taught properly in the early student years. Because brahmacharya prepared the students for the entire life. So later in life, the parents might pass away, you might lose your job, your girlfriend might leave you. All these things you will not treat it like it is the end of the world. And this is happening. We can see in America, where I come from. Psychological counseling is very, very important. Nobody can do without it. But I feel that if brahmacharya was already included in the education, then this would not be needed. The guru would have taken care of it. The guru would have conditioned your mind to face all the challenges of life. So I have this graphic where I say that all these problems today we have, like corruption, tax fraud, voter fraud, domestic violence, alcoholism, depression, stress, substance abuse, sexual violence, crime, all this is because brahmacharya has not been developed in our education system. Right? These are people who have finished education, many of them are graduates and indulging in all these things. The other argument I make is that the reason you should connect to your heritage is that it will make you unique. Okay? Today, most urban young people around the world, they like to wear jeans, eat pizza, watch Hollywood movies, drink coke, take selfies. So everybody is looking like everybody else, right? If you go to any campus, you will find everybody. They're all the same. But that's where I say that if you connect your education heritage, you will stand out in your job interviews, in your essays. Like in America, for all American universities, you have to write that essay which will make you stand out. Now it's very hard for the selectors because everybody is writing something similar, And then I tell the Indian students that, if you connect your heritage, if you know your Shastras, you have read the epics, Ramayana, Mahabharata, you're well versed in the culture, it will show up in your essay as bring out your uniqueness. So this is also one argument for connecting to your heritage. And this is a picture of ancient versus modern education, maybe oversimplified, but this is a traditional well, Pauli as they call it in Gujarat, and engineers of ancient India made that well, and on the right you can see a tube well which has been dug in recent times. Can you see how ugly this structure is on the right? Ugly. There's some pipes over there, there's a hole in the ground, and that's it. So we have lost the Saundarya Drishti which used to be taught, which was part of the learning. Because in Indian education was always based on arts. So you would be learning different arts, you would be learning music, painting, drawing, as you are learning the sciences, right? So it brought out that beauty. It brought out that Saundarya Drishti, and that is how we used to create those beautiful structures that many of them are still standing. Earthquakes have happened, wars have happened, and many of those structures are still standing. So this is an example of the differences in the education. And here is a quote which I like to read out, especially because this is a university. This was said by Professor Norman Brown in the University of Pennsylvania. In 1939 he said this. He said, "We believe that no department of study, particularly in the humanities, in any major university can be fully equipped without a properly trained specialist in the Indic phases of its discipline. We believe that every college which aims to prepare its graduates for intelligent work in the world, which is to be theirs to live in, must have on its staff a scholar competent in the civilization of India." What greater testimony do you want, to the use of knowing India's heritage, knowing about India's civilization, right? So with this, I come to the end of my talk. If you want to contact me, my email address is there, and you can of course get the book from Amazon. Thank you.
We would now like to open the Q&A now to the audience. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Yeah.
Is this on?
Yeah, I think Harish, please.
Hello. Thank you, ma'am, for the most wonderful, elegant talk about the heritage of India. And I had a question. So my question is, we have seen many eminent scholars, but my thinking is, how come there is no mention, not as much mention of women scholars in each of these fields? Even today, we see that there are a lot of women contributions in many of these fields. But how is it that we have somehow lost, or is it that we have lost, or was there a systemic inopportunity for the women of India?
Well, I have.
So in my book, I have a whole chapter on women in education. So there were lots and lots of women scholars. In the Rig Veda, we have mention of so many women scholars. We have mention of debates. Like, we have this Adi Shankara and Vandana Mishra, when they debated, the judge was a woman. Okay, Ubhaya Bharati. So, there are plenty of scholars. And one example from Karnataka itself, which is a very solid example that I came across, there is a carving of a person called Savinir Madi. She's a lady, and there's a carving that was found in Kolar, where she has been portrayed, and she's shown as an ascetic with her hair all tied up, and her name is given, and she's the daughter of so and so, and she's very, very well learned in the Shastras. Okay, her name is mentioned. She's not married. So that means there's a woman who has studied so much. Is not because if she was married, her husband's name would have been given in that inscription. It only talks about her and son or daughter of so and so, and she's master of Shastras. Now, this shows the whole village is so proud of this lady that they made a carving of her. So I don't believe that women scholars were not there or they were not being valued. But yes, maybe they were not as many number as compared to the men because of those times, the biological function of women was also there. There was this acute understanding that you have to create the next generation of people who are scholars, artisans, and if 80% of women all go into higher education and they have no time for the family, then that will not work. So I think a very small percentage of women were going for very high studies. The rest of them, let's remember that we had a skill-based society. So we had all these jatis, right, who were into different professions. And in these jatis, both the men and women were together involved in transmitting knowledge. So if you go into the jati of, say, let's say a Vaidya family, they're all the children are going to become Vaidyas in that family, in that kula. So the women are also involved in that knowledge transmission. They are getting the medicine, they're pounding it, making a paste of it, while the husband is officially the Vaidya who is prescribing the medicine. But the whole family is involved, the women, the children, right? So it's the whole family. So it's not like just today's lenses we are using to say where are the women scholars, which was actually entire families. So every jati was preserving knowledge of that profession, and that was knowledge, let me tell you, like metalworking, sculpting, carving, whatever you call it, carpentry. And so the whole family is coming together to make those products, to sell it or whatever. So that's how women were there. It's just that we don't know their names, but they were very much part of it. And Brahmavadini was the term for the women who went for very high learning. And remember, in ancient times, high learning, high knowledge meant Brahmagnana. So the other things which we are talking, what we call knowledge today, was all lower knowledge. So science, physics, maths, and all that was lower knowledge, which was not considered some huge, big knowledge. It's just a skill. But it was Brahma Jnana, where you are going beyond, you're going to be going into self-awareness, Atma Jnana. And for that, you would have to literally leave the family, because you have to now cast off your ties to your family. And that, some women were doing it, and they were called Brahmavadinis. And they are mentioned now here and there. So women, I think, were very much part of the education, but in the jati system, they were all part of the professional education. And a few of them were going into Vedic studies, Shastric studies.
First, thank you, ma'am, for the very enriching
talk. So my question is that, yeah, of course, India have a very great cultural and educational heritage, but nowadays we see that this is not like that anymore. So what do you think are the reasons that degraded this much, and we are really forgetting about our past and all sorts of these things?
Let me take the next question also, then I'll answer it.
Jai Shri Ram, this is a very specific question. You mentioned some king from Karnataka who brought scholars from some place near Bareilly in UP. I would like to know the time period of that.
The time period, when did that happen?
Yeah, yes.
So your question was about degradation, why it happened. Okay. So actually it started because of the invasions. So 10th, 11th century, we have actual evidence of Nalanda being set on fire and the whole university being destroyed. Can you imagine in today's times a bunch of horsemen come and destroy an entire university? That happened in the 11th century. And then all those, in the eastern part of India, all those universities that were there, they were all destroyed one after the other during the Islamic period. And then Vallabhi also was destroyed during one of the raids. So many of these universities would be destroyed, and then the scholars would be running helter-skelter. They try to take as many manuscripts with them and run, and that's how that was the first onslaught of destruction. And then it went to the south as well. All these temple universities that were there, they were also attacked. So one was the physical destruction that happened, and then came the period of colonization. I actually say that was even more destructive than the physical destruction. Because when the physical damage happened, at least we could see that it's happening, and some people can try to escape. Like Tibet, a lot of scholars escaped from Vikramshila, carrying the manuscript. They went to Tibet, and that's how Tibet became a big center of learning. And similarly, a lot of when the north was being attacked, then many scholars escaped to the south. You see a lot of those exoduses that happened. There are Jain scholars who are carrying manuscripts, and then they started an underground library in Rajasthan. All that happened. But what the colonizers did is that they made the Indians feel very inferior. They told them that you don't have any knowledge. Yours is all rubbish. It's all your medicine is all magic and rubbish. You chant some gibberish and then you give some medicine. All this is nonsense. So what the colonizers did is they broke down that structure of education that we had, and they did it very systematically. That's where we mentioned Dharampal. Dharampal is a scholar who actually investigated all this. He came across the surveys that the British conducted in the 18th and 19th century all across India, in which they tried to find out what was the level of schooling, what was the kind of education that India had. And this was before the British got entrenched in India, all over India, right? Before it became a centralized system. And the British were thinking of where they should spend the tax money, whether they should spend on education or not. So a lot of surveys were conducted, and even at that time in the 18th century, the school system was still intact. Though the higher centers of learning were destroyed in 11th, 12th century onwards, but the Pathshala system was still there in the 18th century. Then the British made the policy of how to destroy, how to defund all these small schools, Pathshalas, and make sure that English medium education is regarded as the mainstream education. And that's how all these vernacular schools, they shut down. The teachers had no food to eat. The earlier system where the whole society was contributing to the schools, where it was considered very meritorious to give dana to the scholars, that system was completely broken by the British. So I hold them solely responsible for the destruction that happened. Because then what happened now, because now everything was being studied in English, so now knowledge has to come only from England. So whatever our knowledge is there, what is there in our manuscripts was regarded as rubbish, just throw it in the dustbin. And that's how we became those kind of followers and copiers, who just copy everything blindly. And that's how we became pale shadows of what we are. And Gandhi said that the British have left us more illiterate than we were 100 years ago. So it's a very famous quote. And you asked about, what was the second? So that was 4th century. 4th century, Mayurvarman brought these 60 scholar families to conduct the yajna and teach the population in Karnataka. So we are called the Arvatoklu, means the 60 families that came. And and also Shashtika is another name given to my community who came from that. But afterwards, many others. Mayur Varman got like, I think, totally 800 scholar families, and they all married in the population, and that's how. And it's a very constant feature, not just Karnataka. All over India, you will find, if you look at histories, in Bengal, you will find from Uttar Pradesh is Gangopadhyay. His name is somebody from Ganga plain has migrated to Bengal, and that's how Gangopadhyay came. So you find a lot of movement of scholars.
Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for the enriching talk. I would actually like to ask, is there any way we can actually go back to that system of education, or is it long gone and it's just that a part of knowledge that is?
Great set of slides. I really liked it. Just had a quick question, just out of curiosity. The book is written about ancient India and heritage education. How did you decide the cover of the book? And
How did I decide the
cover, book cover. Just
That's an easy question. There's one more minute.
Thank you for the lecture. My question is, so you have focused on education as an institution, and also you have linked it with the temple. But education, if you take as an institution, it's integrated with other many institutions. One of the most important institution, I think, is the economic institutions. So, is there any details that you have mapped that how the educational institutions in any regions are having its link and functional links with the economic systems of that particular region and how it helped? So, because now we are talking about employability, skill education, all those things. So, how in the ancient time, how these two had a relationship?
My memory is so poor that I think I should not allow so many questions. I forgot the first one now.
Okay. First, can we go back to the older paper? Yeah. Can we?
Oh, can we go back? Oh, yeah, okay. So, of course, once I finished writing this book, that was a question everybody asked me. They said that, we got deprived of a real education and we want to go back to the ancient education system. How can we do that? So, I feel that there are a lot of, so these Indian knowledge systems that have been started by the government of India, wherein, you will get different branches of Indian knowledge and it will be like an elective that you can take. And that will be just another subject that you can take. That is one way of going back to it. Whether can we bring back exactly the same system that we had, I think that's impossible. That is not possible. But there are lots of Gurukula, a lot of Gurukulas that are functioning in India today, and I am on a mission to go to as many Gurukulas as possible and to see what they are teaching, how they are teaching, and I'm finding some excellent models there. Of course, they are struggling, but they are doing a very good job of taking the most relevant aspects of our ancient Indian education system and integrating it with the modern education. It's work in progress because it's only in the last maybe 10-15 years that this revival has happened. So we're going back to see what we can take. And definitely there are subjects like Jyotisha, which people dismiss as some astrology and some nonsense focus, but it's nothing but mathematics. So if you go and connect to Jyotisha, you will find that your mathematics fundamentals will get strengthened. The way you studied mathematics in school was very boring, and it didn't go to the origin of the subject. It didn't go to the roots of it. When you learn Jyotisha, you'll understand mathematics much better. Like the numbers itself, you'll understand better. There's also philosophical underpinning to all this you're studying the mathematics. It's not just mathematics. There's a philosophy behind it, and that will astonish you when you study mathematics the Indian way. Okay, and then Nyaya Shastra is a subject that definitely can be brought back as a subject because Nyaya Shastra is logic. And when you do the exercises in Nyaya Shastra with reference to today's problems, you will find that you're actually speaking very articulately, very logically. It really makes a lot of sense. I did a short course in Nyaya Shastra and I want to do a full course now. It's so good. So I think we can bring back a lot of these subjects and we still are discovering what we have to make courses out of them. Like, a agriculture, the Chulba Sutras. There are all these shastras. We can see what courses we can make out of it, and this is work in progress. Okay. Cover. The book is the publisher. So when my manuscript is out of my hands, the publisher will decide what the cover will be. But this is basically you will see Saraswati. It's a carving of Saraswati from the Hoysala, from a Hoysala temple. And then in the background there is Nalanda University, the ruins of Nalanda University. That's what it is.
Connecting with economics.
Economic. So that is where you see, there were two kinds of education systems, right? One was the Jati system, which was purely linked to economy. So, the Vedic system where people are studying only the Shastras, memorizing the Vedas, only maybe 10% of the population was engaged in that, 5 or 10%. Very small, and that's why they had to be supported by the population. So 80-90% of the population was only focusing on Jati knowledge, which is economy. So think of everything that the society needs, the economy needs, how it is to be produced. That was the knowledge that was being passed down from generation to generation. So recently somebody did a study of Jati, how it was passing on the knowledge. And there are many studies. The one that I saw at a conference was about how small children from day one, they're already watching their father, mother, uncles, aunts all engaged in that profession. So by the time they reach a certain age, 5-6 years or more, when they're formally instructed, by that age they already know a lot because they're observing the whole family engaged in that profession, right? So the knowledge of certain things like accounting, for example, there's a family of, they're all accountants, they take care of accounts. So the child will be helping the elders in doing that accounting or just watching them. And so they already have imbibed a lot. Or musician's family, for example. So the interesting thing is in that society, by the age of 8, 9, 10, the students already knew everything to be independent. So unlike today, when even after so many years of studying, 21, 22, when they graduate, they are still not able to earn a living by themselves. They can't. Whereas in those days, by the age of 9, 10, like a musician, a child from a musician family can perform a full raga in public. And then somebody else can make a full statue from a Stapati family, that child can make a statue, can sell it in the market and all that, So that way, economy was totally linked to the education, definitely. And they were all linked, and that's why India was one of the richest countries in the world. All these jatis, the members were making a lot of money, they were very proud of their jati, and that's how they did. The Vedic learning was a very small fraction, but these scholars were highly respected because the knowledge that they gave in the Vedic knowledge, was being applied in all the jatis, in all the different education systems, like military training, for example. Even there, the Vedic knowledge was also being applied because they had that understanding. So that's how it was. Economy based was 80%, and the other esoteric and Atma-Jnana based was a very small percentage. But because they travelled around the country, gave discourses to everybody, it informed the other education systems also.
The economy was within the families, or they had to go to school for getting that? For the Kula.
They had Kula, yeah. It's not
They used
just.
to go to the school for that, or they used to?
It was usually in-house.
Okay.
In-house. It was, but in those days, every jati had its own temple also, and the temple also could be used. Many of the jatis, they had their own devta, so they had their temple, they had their priests. There is a mistaken notion that only Brahmins were becoming the priests. But many of these jatis had their own temples. So the temple buildings could be used for schooling, or any rich person's house could be used for classes, or there would be a proper parshala. All that was there. Agrahara was for Vedic learning. Agrahara was a place where all the gurus used to live, their houses used to be located next to each other. And the kings would give land to Agrahara. So these scholars in different disciplines would all be living there, and the students can go to their house and study under them and go back.
So we have a question. This is the last question.
Nice talk. So you focused mainly on the Indian knowledge system. So there were some other countries like maybe China or Greece or some other European countries who would have also some great foundation and some knowledge system like we had. is there any fusion knowledge system which exists, which takes the best out of all the knowledge systems and then brings it not only just focus on the ancient Indian system, all other successful or ancient great countries, and then give a get the best out of all those systems. Is there some your views on that?
That sounds like a topic of research for you.
We should look into that, whether there was any kind of perfect fusion. I don't think there was any perfect fusion. Everybody was adapting, like in Cambodia and all the Southeast Asian countries. Some of our scholars went there and taught them, they learned from our universities and went back and they developed their own knowledge system there. So you will find that similar things that were taught in India were also being taught there, but with a flavor of their own culture. So there are inscriptions in Cambodia where, the kavya, there is like 50 shlokas in one inscription, 100 shlokas, and all in excellent Sanskrit. So, you will find in all around India, all those countries from where the students would come and study in India, they went back and they developed the poetry, they developed the grammar, the accounting and all that. So they were doing their own adaptation of the fusion. So they were adapting our knowledge system with their culture and doing their own fusion. And it was working for them.
Alexandria Library also had our style. Alexandria.
Yeah, okay, that's one example. So I talked about how the Arabic people took Indian knowledge. So there was a library called the Alexandria Library. So not Arabic, the Greeks, sorry. The Greeks had this famous Alexandria Library, which is in modern day Egypt. Egypt also was controlled by the Greeks. So in that library, the books of all the, from the countries around were kept there. So it was a reference library for them. And Alexandria was a place where the ships used to pass. Ships from India also used to pass from there. Ships from everywhere used to pass. The ones which used to export products. And so we can surmise that a lot of Indian books reached Alexandria Library. Because Alexandria Library had the policy that any ship that passes by, take away all their books, whatever books they have, and we will make copies of the books, and then we'll give the copy to them and we will keep the original. So they had this very funny policy, and then in the library they catalogued it also, from the ships, books that came from the ship, books came from this place, books came, so that way they had catalogued it. And so I surmise that a lot of knowledge from India was kept over there in the form of books that came from ships.
We close the question answer round for today, and we thank our speaker for gracing this occasion with her presence and a wonderful talk. And now we will request Bhavani ma'am, one of our well-wishers who has always been with Vivekananda Study Circle, to present a small token of appreciation from our side. There are a host of other things as well, which we will do off stage.
Should I be here?
Yeah. Any questions you can take off stage, and thanks for coming. I mean, this is mid-sem going on in ISC, so we would have a lot more students had it been, say, April or something like that. But anyway, yeah, thanks to the audience for taking time out for attending this talk. Anyone who is interested in getting a copy of her book can get it from Amazon. Both of them are available. Apart from that, if you want to locally procure it, Then Blossoms and Higginbottoms in MG Road also have copies of the books. So it would be great if you can do that. Or I think Vitasta also, the publisher also has an online facility, right?
I think Vitasta is a website like
Yeah, yeah.
or Amazon
Yeah.
or from the bookstores also.
Yes.